Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thanks to CTA for lending us this amazing space at the Innovation House. Section 230, it's certainly been in the news a lot these past couple of days and past couple of weeks. You saw legislation introduced from Senator Hawley just last week. And one of the things that's been a question on my mind has been, we talk about the importance and the value of Section 230, but what is the value of Section 230? And fortunately, I was able to connect with Mike Masnick over here, over at the Copia Institute, who has produced the report that you have on your chairs, which outlines and gives us finally some quantifiable values to Section 230 and its value on the American economy. Now, quick overview of Section 230, long story short, it's the foundation on which much of our user-generated content is built. It's the foundation on which much of our online experience today is built. It's got two key components. One is it says that platforms are not responsible for the content created by others. Kind of simple. The idea behind that goes back to a bookstore back in the 1950s that was the seller was being arrested for having what was considered at the time a pornographic book. These days, it would be on TV at 9 p.m. The court looked at that and said, you know what, we don't want to expect booksellers to have to know every word and verse for every piece of content they're selling. Fast forward to the mid-90s, apply the same standard to the internet. It has a second key component, which says that platforms can remove content that they deem otherwise objectionable and are not held liable for the removal of the content or any content that they don't remove. This is an online equivalent of the Good Samaritan Clause. Good Samaritan doctrine suggests that if I walk down the street and I see somebody suffering from a heart attack and I give them CPR and I break their sternum in doing so, I'm held harmless because I'm trying to be a good actor. This component of Section 230 had the same intent, where Good Samaritan, platform trying to remove content it deems objectionable, isn't held liable for removing content just because it wants to do the good thing. Okay, that's a nice level set. I will now ask Mike to give us a couple of minutes on his report, and then we'll go to our panel. We have Mike Masnick from the Copia Institute. We have Emma Llanso from the Center for Democracy and Technology, and we have Jesse Blumenthal from Stand Together. Mike?
Sure. Just to start, in terms of why we sort of put together this report, Section 230 has obviously been something that has been talked about an awful lot in the industry in terms of on a few different factors. We talk about why it's been really important for free speech and enabling free speech on the internet, but there's also been a lot of talk about sort of the economic value of it, and I think it was David Post at one point said that he believed it had created trillions of dollars worth of value, that one law. Jeff Kossoff has this new book out called 26 Words That Created the Internet that talks about how important it was to actually generating the internet. And what troubled me on that, at least, was that we didn't have specifically data to back up those claims that show that. So the thinking behind the report originally was, can we find some evidence to show what the actual economic impact is on innovation, on startups, on the economy? And so we approached it from a few different ways, but basically we said, can we look at situations where we can compare some sort of difference? So in some cases, it's looking at different regions, so US versus EU, which have slightly different intermediary liability regimes. Can we see what the difference was? Both implemented them around the same time, EU a little bit after the US, and the EU's is not nearly as strong as CDA 230. Can we see what sort of differences were developed from there? Can we start to look at other differences as well? Within the US alone, we have CDA 230, but that doesn't cover copyright. So there's DMCA 512, which is sort of the copyright intermediary liability regime, which is not as all-encompassing. It's a safe harbor as opposed to an immunity. The CDA 230 presents more of an immunity. So can we look at the differences that have developed in terms of businesses that rely on one versus the other? And then we start to look at places where intermediary liability regimes had changed, whether it was a major court ruling that impacted the interpretation, or if the actual regulations changed, and could we see a difference? And so we figured in looking at all these different things, we could compare and begin to come up with some data-backed evidence for what the overall impact was of CDA 230 in terms of investment, in terms of competition, in terms of innovation. And what we found, and I'm not going to go through all of the numbers, but you can go through the report and see them in the graphs and the charts and everything, is that basically in every case where we looked was that the better the protections were for intermediaries, the more investment you had in startups, the more innovation, the more success you had, the more competition you had among different companies, over and over again. And when you strengthen the laws, you would see an immediate uptick in investment and startups and competition. When you turn down that knob, when you decrease the amount of protections for intermediaries, you saw sort of a corresponding decrease in investment. And so, over and over again, what the report shows is that, all the evidence that we looked at effectively shows that, having this strong protections, in particular CDA 230, which we think are the sort of strongest setup of the protections right now, that it has driven a tremendous amount of investment, innovation, and competition. I mean, a lot of what we've seen is that the number of startups that were funded in different spaces based on the level of intermediary liability protections shows that it really drives the startup ecosystem quite a bit. So there's a lot of sort of data. We used a few different databases to go through and analyze all of these different things and back it up. And part of the idea behind the report is that this is not necessarily the definitive report on the subject. I mean, part of, as I said, there was sort of this lack of numerical evidence to back up these claims. And so I really see this as the start of the analysis, and I'm planning to do more research on this, and I'm hoping others that will also pick up and run with it, and we can get more and more data to support these ideas. And so that's, have a seat.
Thanks, Mike. And we're kind of seeing a macro example of that here in the U.S. economy, right? We're seeing regulations go down, and at the same time, we're seeing investments and everything going up. And you found a direct correlation between platform protection and investment, it seems like.
Yeah, and again, the report demonstrates it in a bunch of different ways. I think probably the most interesting one is when you look at the U.S. versus the EU, right? Because you have the U.S. going back before all this, there was certainly more investment in the U.S. than in the EU already, more venture capital, more, the startup ecosystem was better in the U.S. already, but it was about, roughly twice as good. If you looked at sort of where things were sort of through the 80s and 90s in terms of U.S. versus EU investment in startups, about twice as much happening in the U.S. Versus the EU. And then you see this split that sort of happens after, CDA 230 is sort of, mid to late 90s. There's a little bit of time where, people start figuring out what it means. You have a couple court cases where people are understanding it. So around 98, 99, people sort of have a good idea of what it is. And you see this sort of explosion of, that's sort of the original .com bubble is, what they call it. But there's this explosion of investment. But a lot of it was in sort of platforms that, that really relied heavily on the protections of CDA 230 to be able to do what they did, to enable this kind of speech. And then Europe with the e-commerce directive, which passed in 2000, so a little bit after that, sort of really went into effect in 2002. And then you sort of see, it's funny, you kind of see this lag where the EU investment remains low, and then starting around a little after 2002, when that goes into effect, you begin to see that trickle up. And if you're looking at sort of specifically internet platforms, you see it sort of follow, but not nearly as strong and not nearly as impressive as the US's investment in those startups, and you see sort of where, how the investment flows, and comparatively, like, the U.S. companies are much more likely to get larger investments, over $10 million or over $100 million, much more likely for platform type companies to get those investments in the U.S. versus the EU, where they have the not as strong protections.
So, Jesse and Emma, I mean, you've been talking about Section 230 for quite some time now, several years. Does this change your thinking of Section 230, its value? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think the report is really helpful for all of the reasons Mike has been talking about, to actually get some concrete data. And I think it's figure 1.3, and there's the comparison between the US and EU over a couple of different kind of scales of funding. And so what you see is just in the overall kind of investment economy in the US versus Europe, it's significantly stronger in the US across all of these different levels. So it's not only the number of sites where you get over $100 million worth of investment, but there are thousands more online services and websites that are getting 5 million or less investment, which is not the next Google maybe, but it's important. And it's really important when we think about kind of the strength of the internet for innovation, for the economy, and for things like free expression. The availability of a diversity of platforms, of having multiple different, maybe they're small, maybe they're very niche, maybe they're not trying to be the next ultra mega website, but they can make a going concern out of running a small website that offers a very particular service, very particular users, and that's a really important sector of the economy that can get glossed over in our conversations, especially here in DC, about sort of the future of 230, the future of the internet economy. We tend to zero in on the very biggest for understandable reasons. But one thing I think the report really does help draw out is that there is a whole sizable long tail of online services that have really benefited, it appears, from the kinds of protections that they get under Section 230.
So I think Emma's totally right to focus on the long tail and the range of firms that benefit from 230 and the sort of entrepreneurial activity that creates. I'll make sort of 2 points in addition to that. One, just to underscore something that Mike and Emma said. So I work at Stand Together, the Stand Together philanthropic community, which most people in the room probably know as the Koch network. I spend a lot of my time with the academics we support. So we support about 1,000 academics, about 370 colleges and universities across the country. Whenever you go to academic conferences, whenever you read academic papers, like, you can almost be assured that one of the conclusions is more research is necessary. And that has become sort of like a running joke in the academic world, but it's exceptionally true in this area, right? So Mike goes through in the sort of lit review section of the paper up front and points out there are a couple of assessments of this, right? So some people have said some stuff. There was a Neuro study from a couple of years ago, and now there's Mike's paper. But there are a number of sort of open research questions around what is the economic value of Section 230. And so I think one place where this report is particularly successful is it tries to look at some of the inputs or signals you would see if this was a sort of major economic force, right? So that is important. Emma talked about the importance of the long tail and to small firms. I think, so I'll take the other half of that and talk about some of the big firms. So Mary Meeker just came out with her annual report, 2019 Internet Trends. One of the slides in there, which she does regularly, is what are the top 30 internet companies by market cap. And if you look at the top 30 internet companies by market cap, 18 of the top 30 are American, and it's 14 of the top 20. And what you see really is a sort of clustering. U.S. firms, which are dominant globally and play a major economic role. A handful of Chinese firms that are either implicitly or explicitly state-backed, and whether they are or aren't have like benefit from unique local market controls, right? Like if you basically block out the rest of the world from competing for a fifth of humanity, you can build some pretty big companies, and they've got 6 or 7 of them on the top 20 or top 30 list. And then a scattershot. There's a Swedish firm, an Australian firm, an Argentinian firm, a Japanese firm, and a Canadian firm. Right, and that's it in the top 30. Right, so there are 18 American firms, there are 7 Chinese firms, and there are 5 other. And I think one of the things, and it's not uniquely Section 230, I think there are other factors too, but one of the things that this report clearly suggests is that Section 230 is one of the sort of crucial differentiators between the US and the rest of the world. Because if you compare the US to Europe, and I think Mike does a really good job in the report of drawing this out, you have comparable populations, both educated, both have access to capital markets, both have talented workforces, right? Like the sort of levels of investment disparity, which in some years it's 5 times higher, 6 times higher, like really starkly different numbers. In the US, much higher and much stronger compared to the EU, are the reflection of the collection of policy choices that we've made.
I mean, but Jesse, you're talking about government helping businesses. A lot of people are saying that this is just a handout for tech, and we don't need it anymore. Google's gotten big, Twitter's gotten big, Facebook's gotten big. We don't need Section 230 anymore. I mean, what do you say to that?
So it's wrong. It's wrong in a couple of ways.
Okay.
It's wrong because the appropriate way to think about Section 230 is who do you want to hold responsible when bad things happen on the internet? Do you want to hold the people who did the bad things responsible, or do you want to hold the tools they use? And this debate around user-generated content and platform liability, that's really what it boils down to at the end of the day. Is who's responsible when people are bad to each other? Because quite frankly, they are. The question that I mentioned, the sort of like elements that go into a policy environment, right? So Section 230 is one component piece of this, but it's clearly not the only thing in there, right? If you look at what are the other sort of major policy drivers that occurred in that mid-90s period that led to this explosion of growth, I'd point to 3 things, right? In addition to Section 230, to immigration, to trade, and to free speech protections. Right, so on immigration, it is one heck of a coincidence if you just believe that more than half of the top US tech firms are either founded by immigrants or founded by the children of immigrants. Right, like there's an overwhelming ability of the US to attract and retain the best and brightest from around the world. And drastic and arbitrary cuts to our legal immigration system are counterproductive and unnecessary. You know, I think this is an example of where our shared future is clearly better when we're welcoming to those who want to come here and contribute. On trade, there were a couple of other policy choices that we made. Right? So the Clinton administration, to their credit, the Clinton administration Commerce Department in the 90s, or at a very similar time, put out a report that at the time said something that was revolutionary that today we probably take for granted. What the report said was, it's okay to do business on the internet. Right, at the time, this was a largely used by the internet was a thing largely used by a handful of government actors and academics. It was very closed, it was very nascent, and the idea that to say in a sort of like permissionless way, it's okay for you to come in and experiment and try something new and connect people has a real impact. And I think it's why you see that sort of similar sort of laws that allow for space for entrepreneurial activity, for dynamism and experimentation, like Section 230, to continue to occur. And then the third thing I'd say is the free speech protections, right? You had the Reno versus ACLU decision, which basically said the First Amendment applies to the internet. You had a number of other policy choices which strengthened the sort of free expression values that are uniquely American. They're held here in much greater esteem and with greater fervor than they are in Europe, and certainly than they are in China. And that value of connectivity and of expression and of speech it plays a real role. You know, one thing I'd say is, if you take a firm like Twitter, Twitter used to say, a number of their executives used to say that they were from the free speech wing of the free speech party, and that was a broadly shared ethos among all of the tech firms that wanted to connect the world, right? Like there are a lot of these sort of speech values embedded in these businesses. Many of them, quite frankly, have backed away from that, and we disagree, right? I think that one thing that many of the firms that have thrived as a result of their strong free speech protection should do is they should stand up to governments both at home and abroad that want to limit free speech protections and that want to undermine speech rights and say no, like we actually support speech and we stand for that, and they should live those values. So I'd say those three things as a basket alongside Section 230 are the types of policy conditions that you get when you combine speech protections with immigration, with trade, and being sort of open to the world, that you get the type of vibrant and active sector of the economy that thrives.
And Mike, one of the things Jesse talks about is uniquely American.
Yeah.
And your report seems to differentiate a lot, U.S. versus blah.
Sure.
How are you sure that that is attributable to, that's the differentiating factor, that's from us versus the rest of the world?
Well, that was part of the point of the report, to look at all of these different examples, right? And the more comparisons you could pull, if you just had one, then you could say, well, it must be some other factor here, or there might be some third variable that we're not paying attention to. But the idea, with the report and looking at all of these different variables and seeing the same thing effectively every time, I think really calls out how unique and specific 230 in particular was, and sort of what the impact is. And to go back to the point that Jesse was making, which and Emma made before that, and to the question that you asked before, which I think is really important, is how much it's driven the sort of investment across the different startups and the number of companies that have come out of it, and that space for experimentation. At a time when I think there's a lot of discussion about competition issues and whether or not there should be a different approach to competition, and that is also playing out around the world. The fact that this setup drove so much investment in so many different companies, and it really created this space for competition, and continues to. If you look at the amount of investment that has continued in these spaces over time, it continues to happen. I worry that attempts to sort of take away 230 or undermine 230 or sort of related protections leads to a world where you actually get less competition and you sort of lock in some of the players who are already there. So I think that there's a lot to be said for having the sort of setup that enables competition. The one other thing that I'll add to build on Jesse's point about it not just being intermediary liability, there was one of the examples in the report was Argentina, where there was a lawsuit there where they put in place very strong intermediary liability, or they read the law to imply sort of CDA 230-like protections into the law. And there we actually didn't see that. That was like the one example where we didn't see a big shift that followed that from investment. But what we saw there was it was such a small market for investment in the first place, so that there were other elements that were holding back the sort of startup ecosystem and investment in internet companies within Argentina. So I tried to make it clear in the report that we don't see like intermediary liability protection as being the exclusive thing. Like you could just turn it on and put CDA 230 in some random country and suddenly next Silicon Valley. I don't think that's the way it works. I think that you have to have all of these other policy frameworks in place and capital and education and all these other things. But when you have that, and when you have investment in startups, if you want to have that sort of flow of innovation, the protections that 230 provides seems to really sort of turn the knob in a really useful way.
Now, Emma's one of the preeminent world travelers that I know. Every time I talk to her, she is either going or coming back from some foreign country. But and they've taken a different approach, especially Europe, for example, where they recognize the potential dangers of having open platforms, and they are trying to wrangle them in. And I totally understand that. When you see the levels of terrorism or hate speech and stuff like that, they're kind of going in the opposite direction of Section 230. We're starting to hear mumblings about that domestically, right? Disinformation, deepfakes. How is that not the right response?
Leading question, yeah. No, so the way that conversations are going in Europe in particular are interesting because they've had a relatively strong, like maybe the second strongest liability framework in the e-commerce directive for the past 18, 19 years. But you run pretty quickly into the dynamics of how an EU directive versus the actual implementation by every member state actually comes out. So there's been a fair amount of uncertainty still in Europe about exactly how will any particular court in any particular country rule on specific liability questions, because every state is sort of left to their own to implement what they call a notice and action framework. So a framework where the intermediary can receive notice of potentially illegal content and then have to take some action. Often it's takedown, sometimes it's notice forwarding. You need to notify the user that that they've potentially posted something illegal. So there's been room for kind of really developing and refining that notice and action framework in Europe for many years. And many advocates, both for innovation and for free expression, have pushed the European Commission, the European Parliament to try to articulate more clearly what would a real kind of very clear, very stable notice and action framework look like. Essentially, think of something like the DMCA in the US, but kind of applied to things other than copyright in Europe. It's maybe not the ideal framework, it might have some drawbacks, but you could imagine a version of the European system that has a lot more clarity to it. Instead, what is going on in Europe is they're looking at sort of revamping the whole concept of how they're protecting or how they're requiring intermediaries to respond to potentially illegal content. So we're hearing a lot of discussion about things like having a duty of care, a much more generalized sort of legal obligation to police what's going on platforms, both for illegal content, but in some cases even beyond that. The United Kingdom right now is looking at a proposal around duties of care for both illegal content, but also this new category of lawful but harmful content. And so the discussion with the UK kind of agencies and Parliament right now is, from CBT's perspective, trying to help them understand that if you put liability on a social media company to police speech that you recognize is lawful, you've essentially rendered that speech unlawful, right? Like that is government action pressuring an intermediary to try to control speech that actually the government could not go after directly. And we're seeing a lot of that throughout different kinds of initiatives in Europe, using government actors like law enforcement, using companies' terms of service, again, to go after content that the government might not be able to take down directly by saying, this actually clearly violates a law. So that it's, I understand how the conversations in Europe have gotten to that point. There is a lot of concern about the amazing proliferation of content and speakers online that the internet enables. Lots of concerns about things like hate speech, terrorist content, a lot of the same conversations that we're having here in DC. But in Europe, those conversations are much further down the path to actually looking at proposed legislation and having some of these debates over, how far can you push the intermediaries to try to police what is acknowledged to be lawful communication. So that's something I think it behooves everybody in the US to pay close attention to, because all of these, the 18 out of 30, top earning US internet companies, I would wager most, if not all of them, have a significant presence in Europe as well. That's not a market that companies are going to exit. So the way that the European legislative debate develops is going to have significant impacts on people here in the US, both on companies, but also on people and our access to information and what we can say on these platforms as well.
And Jesse, one of the things that Mike pointed to was you can't just flip on the light switch of Section 230 and suddenly have innovation. But it seems like that may be what we're trying to force into the USMCA, which is our trade agreement with Mexico and Canada. There's a provision that kind of talks about intermediary liability and kind of taking Section 230 and putting that in a trade agreement. There's been a lot of pushback on that, suggesting that, well, if we put it in a trade agreement, we can't talk about it here. And I mean, I don't know where I am on that argument. What are your thoughts about that?
So I think that Section 230 is U.S. law, right? It's the foundation under which so many of our largest and smallest, most innovative companies are able to build a business and be successful. It's not unreasonable to me that that would be a piece of a international trade deal that the U.S. has negotiated with other companies, a deal that would reflect U.S. law. Right, and so, without going into the ins and outs of the entirety of USMCA, which is an entirely different panel for an entirely different time, what I would say, though, is that one of the real challenges, and Emma, I think, really importantly hit on this right now, of what's going on in Europe, and I'd say, quite frankly, what's going on across the road here, too, is that there's a lot of things that Congress might want to pass into law that are, quite frankly, like blatantly unconstitutional. This happens pretty regularly. Like, people pass their proposed bills that are just like not going to fly under the Bill of Rights. It's a good thing we have a Bill of Rights. But the worrying thing about the situation that Emma's describing, both in Europe and increasingly here, is that you don't actually have to pass the bill, right? If you just sort of threaten firms enough, if you cajole them enough, if you haul them before Congress and create a series of, like a sort of media firestorm around this, you're effectively working the refs, right? You can try and lean on firms using a sort of soft power to implement below First Amendment restrictions on user speech that you couldn't actually pass into law because you know the courts would strike it down. And that type of like working the refs activity is really worrying. Ronald Reagan very famously and very frequently used to say that the 9 scariest words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help," right? And so there are a lot of things that, quite frankly, I'm pissed off about major tech companies right now. I'm sure you are too, right? Like, there are policies that major tech firms have that I think are misguided, or not what I would write, or I disagree with, right? There are plenty of content moderation decisions on these one-off cases where I'd say, you made the wrong call, or like, you didn't impose your own rules correctly, or this is not the right decision, right? But the idea that the better solution to this is that the government's going to come in and either explicitly through law or implicitly through sort of like threatening them in bad headlines, impose a government-mandated speech code online is definitely worse. So there are solutions to these problems, right? The solutions involve creating forums and demanding transparency about what rules platforms use when they make content moderation decisions. It's about public pressure when companies make the wrong decision to say, no, you made it wrong, and now we're going to all speak out and say, you made the wrong call here. And quite frankly, like, if they're saying one thing and doing another, we have laws against fraud in this country. Like, this is not a new concept. You can't tell consumers one thing and then do something else. And so there's transparency, there's public advocacy, there's laws against unfair and deceptive business practices. There are plenty of existing structures and tools, both within government and outside of government, that I think address some of the complaints, some of which are legitimate, some of which I think are sort of political stunts. But the idea that government implemented speech codes are the preferred solution is, I think, just really dangerous. And little quick thought experiment, and then I'll end my little rant. So there are, I don't know, 97 Democrats running for president right now, something like that. And the president's running for re-election too. I really don't care who you're gonna vote for. Picture in your head the person who you absolutely disagree with the most, and think of the issue that you absolutely disagree with them the most on. And if you're comfortable with that person as president, either through their FTC appointments or just directly, imposing a speech code on that issue that you really, really disagree with them on, then fine. Like, we should rethink this system. But like, if that gives you pause, if you're worried about like sort of politicians determining the speech codes of what individuals can and can't say online, then we should look for solutions that don't involve government setting up either formal or informal structures of ways to regulate First Amendment protected speech.
Just to sort of add on to what just pointed out, and I think it's helpful to sometimes have examples, and we all default to this mode, and Jesse said at one point, like, if one of the platforms makes a wrong decision, we can speak out or something. But I think it's important to recognize like right or wrong is a very, very fuzzy area, and it becomes very, very difficult. And I think one of the problems with a lot of these questions is that people assume that most of these decisions are very black and white, and that there is a right answer and a wrong answer. And yeah, maybe there's some edge cases, but like when you look at the reality, the edge is most of them. And the example I go back to over and over again when you talk about like the soft power thing, this goes back over a decade now, because it was Senator Lieberman at the time, got very upset about terrorist content on YouTube. And very strongly came out and said YouTube needs to take this content down. And like your initial reaction, again, like you were saying, sometimes you're like, that's bad content. We don't want ISIS to be able to promote propaganda and all this kind of stuff. And so there's public pressure, and you have a senator threatening all sorts of questionable things. And so YouTube pulls down this content. Of course, what happens? One of the first channels that they pull down is actually a human rights group in Syria that's documenting human rights abuses. But that content looks very, very similar to ISIS propaganda content. It's how who should be making that call, and how do you make that call? There's a lot of context involved there, and being able to figure that out becomes very, very difficult.
And if I can just add on to that, to put like a couple of numbers around this, right? The scale here is the important piece to keep in mind, right? So like, let's just pick on Facebook, because everyone picks on Facebook. Something like 1 billion photos a day are uploaded to Facebook. Facebook moderates something like 50 million pieces of content today in 50 different languages worldwide. You're going to get some of that right. You're going to get some of that wrong, right? Like you would hope that over time you get the vast majority of it right. But if you look at their transparency reports around the content moderation decisions they make, the automated systems are able to take down like nudity really well, right? Like photo recognition for nudity is pretty good. Lawful speech that violates Facebook's terms of service, really, really difficult, right? Much more like 50% accuracy. And that's even just assuming that you agree with the decision they were going to make, right? That's their ability to correctly implement what they view to be their own rules. And that's before you get into this broader array of, well, who should be speaking and should this actually be allowed on the platform? And so just given the scale of content, right? Like 400 hours of video uploaded to YouTube every minute, something like 5,000 tweets a second, right? Just given the scale of content that humans are creating, you're going to get a whole bunch of false positives and a whole bunch of false negatives in any given day. And so I think the reasonable question is, how do you minimize the errors relative to their own rules? How do you make sure that the process is as transparent as it can be, while respecting that these are private firms that have speech and association rights? And how do you make sure that they're being upfront with their customers about what the terms of the deal are?
I mean, oh, go ahead, Emma.
To follow on that, and the call for transparency has been pretty clear and pretty consistent, especially from major social media platforms for years, and it really is incumbent on them to explain more about how their policies and their systems are actually affecting the information environment. Like, it's not unreasonable for their users, for the public in general, for members of Congress to have questions about that, because these are big companies that have a huge amount of influence. So it's good to see the transparency reporting that we've started to get from companies like Facebook and YouTube, giving some more information about how their community guideline enforcement actually works. There's a lot more that we can see. One positive thing for Facebook, just since everybody picks on them, is they're actually fairly upfront if you read down into the details and the footnotes of their transparency reports about the things where it is technically difficult to even assess the prevalence of a certain kind of content that violates their rules. So as Jesse was saying, nudity, pretty easy to gauge, but things like hate speech, and they, to their credit, are upfront about not even really being able to measure how much hate speech is on their platform, because it's hard to define, but also because technically it is hard to detect. So in our public policy conversations, I think we also need to have just a better understanding across the board of what are the pieces of the problems that we're talking, what are the problems we're talking about? What are the pieces of it that we actually can really understand and quantify and measure? What are the things we can't measure and why? And then to the point about just needing more research in general on this, I think it's really important for these companies to think even more and do more about how to enable in an ethical and privacy respecting way, like independent, peer-reviewed research on the effects of their content moderation systems. Because I think, as to certainly in the current political environment, there's only so much anybody's going to listen to the numbers that Facebook itself puts out or YouTube itself puts out. We're going to want to see confirmation from independent sources about, like, okay, yeah, they really are characterizing these dynamics in this particular way. And that's a difficult question. There's a data protection issue. There's just what is the right kind of research question to engage in. But I think that's the direction where we need to see the conversations going, because otherwise it's a lot of people throwing high-level talking points back and forth at each other, and a lot of argument from emotion of confusion and concern, which is, again, very understandable, but won't lead us in the most productive policy direction.
So Mike has this report, right? But at the same time, Jesse, you were talking about government control. But this isn't a First Amendment issue. A lot of people are saying that, look, the government giveth Section 230, the government can taketh Section 230. I ran this by my law school class. I mean, couldn't they just take it back, and why shouldn't they? And this is for the whole panel.
Yeah. So could they? Sure. Right. Like, it's a law passed by Congress. Congress can repeal it. Should they? No, absolutely not. Right. Like Eric Goldman. So one homework assignment. Eric Goldman has a great but very accessible law school or law review article entitled "Why Section 230 is Better Than the First Amendment." I would encourage you to read it. It goes through the substantive reasons why it promotes and enhances speech, as well as some of the procedural protections there. But why Congress ought not do this, I think, goes to the heart of Mike's report, right? Mike's report doesn't say that Section 230 is the only thing in the secret sauce, but it's pretty clearly an ingredient, right? And so to the extent that you want competition in this space, to the extent that you want a handful of companies that are big right now not to be the same companies 10 years from now or 20 years from now, the best thing you can do is preserve the types of protections that make it possible for anyone to compete in the space, and they do so by making a value judgment, which Congress does all the time. The value judgment is people are responsible for their own actions. If you go onto Facebook or Twitter or name your platform of choice and defame someone, you can be sued. We have laws against defamation. If you go on and post content that is otherwise the types of things that people can be sued over, right? That is legal. Now, we favor strong free speech protections at the state level, the federal level. I can talk about our work on anti-SLAPP and Section 230, all this stuff if you want after. But the point is that there is an implicit value judgment about who you want to hold responsible when humans are bad to each other. The people who are doing the bad things were the tools they used. And in the mid-90s, Congress made a very clear decision that the only way that this thing works, the only way that this thing scales, if you don't want the next time you type in a tweet to get a message that says, thank you, your tweet is under review, it will be posted sometime in the next 48 hours, right? The things that allow for user-generated content to exist at scale is holding individuals responsible for their actions, not the tools they use.
And to follow up to that, I think, again, it's sort of interesting to look at, since so much of the focus is on Google and Facebook, it's interesting to look at how it impacts other players as well. And there was just this case that was decided in Australia yesterday. I don't know if you saw this, but that I think is a demonstration of where you go if you sort of remove 230 protections Australia's had a bunch of, they don't have these kinds of protections really. They've had a bunch of legal rulings over the last few years that have sort of continually sort of chipped away at any sort of sense of intermediate liability protections. So there's this ruling yesterday which involves Facebook, but only sort of tangentially. And hopefully I'll explain the basic situation, and hopefully people begin to realize the problems of where this leads, where someone claimed he was defamed through comments on Facebook. But he didn't sue Facebook. He didn't sue the people who defamed the comments. The comments were in response to news articles from Australian publications. There were 2 or 3 Australian publications. He sued the publications for the comments on Facebook. And the court has decided, this was the ruling that came out yesterday that sort of blew my mind, because I can't comprehend how you could get to this endpoint, that they had an expert come in and testify that if those publications had hacked Facebook, literally they used the word hacked Facebook, they could have uploaded a filter of the 100 most common words, the, this, whatever, and therefore they could have blocked those comments. The fact that they chose not to hack Facebook, create this 100 most common word filter, block all comments, review all comments, and then allow the comments that were okay to be posted, therefore makes them liable as the publisher of those comments. Right? And so now you're thinking like, okay, this is, even though Facebook is a central part of this story,
Yeah.
now you're talking about these smaller publishers who, you know, I wouldn't have known I wouldn't have even thought to put in, you know, to hack Facebook, to put up this filter, to block these comments. They're now being held liable in a defamation case. And they could have done something to prevent this potentially, allegedly defamatory speech. Therefore, they suddenly become liable for the fact that they didn't take these proactive steps. And it creates all of this sort of, you know, pressure downward, right? And so, you know, if it's just about Facebook, like, you know, maybe Facebook can deal with these things, maybe not, who knows? But like, when you start talking about everybody else who posts content to Facebook, you know, whether you're, you know, an individual or a small publication or an organization that has a Facebook feed, do you want to be liable for all the comments that people post on that? You know, in Australia, apparently you are.
I mean, so what if, and I get your argument about, you know, the long tail. Emma brought this up earlier. Section 230 enables the small guys. What if we just focus a bunch of contingencies to get Section 230 protections, to enjoy this government incentive? Once you reach a certain size, then you have to start jumping through some hoops, because then you've got the infrastructure, you've got size, you're certainly big enough. Doesn't that seem reasonable? To anyone, yeah.
I mean, that's one way to approach it, but like, it's not something that we've experimented with, and suddenly you're putting in place incentives that we don't know what it does. I mean, from the researcher, if I
Yeah.
put the researcher hat, really interesting to see what happens. But you know, you're putting in place a very new set of incentives that could have a huge impact. And so, like, when you're talking about from the investment standpoint, you know, and the long tail, and these are all important, but a lot of those investments, whether or not they fund the sort of long tail and the smaller companies and everything like that, a lot of those investments are going into investors trying to create the next Google, the next Facebook, the next Uber, the next, you know, whatever, the next Apple. They're trying to invest in those things. If you're putting in conditions that say, you know, you are allowed to have this model up until you're successful, and then suddenly you have to change your entire model, that actually, I think, would end up seriously impeding the investment, because you know that it's going to be that much harder to create the next whatever, and to create those competing companies. So you have that, and then also you just don't know what that does for the company who, like, well, if I've been successful in building this company with this model, and I know as soon as I hit my 30 millionth user, suddenly my entire model has to change. Well, I don't, like, I'm glad I don't have that problem, but if I were at a startup that was like trying to deal with that, I don't know how I would deal with that, and I worry about sort of the incentive structure that creates. Are you incentivizing there to only be really small companies, or you're incentivizing sort of weird workarounds, or you're incentivizing companies to like just switch midstream and hope that they can figure out, once you get large enough, we're going to have an entirely different business model? I think that's problematic.
So I think it creates two bad incentives. One that Mike just hit on, it incentivizes you to like artificially grow towards government-imposed targets, right? There's no reason necessarily to think that 30 million monthly active users is the optimal number, as opposed to 29 or 31 or 50 or 100. And so you have people sort of gaming the system. You see this right now with there's a whole lot of small businesses that happen to employ 49 people. It's not an accident, right? They're like reacting to the incentive structure that exists in the regulatory state. The other thing you have is it strongly incentivizes lobbying about, well, what are the other terms, right? So now we're getting into the business of, there isn't a uniform set where everyone's competing in the same playing field. There's a set of rules for the big guys and a set of rules for everyone else. And who do you think is best equipped to hire lobbyists and come in and lobby expert agencies and recognition, independent economic analysis, and all those types of things that get this sort of Swiss cheesed approach. So like if you want our laws regulating internet companies and speech online to look like the tax code, then that's a great path to go down. But if you think that it's problematic that everyone's got their own special carve out and their own special handout, and if the government ends up picking winners and losers, it's a really dangerous path to walk down.
There's also just one really fun point. If you're using like, average users, those numbers are not particularly accurate. I mean, like there's no good way to really measure. I mean, in some cases, but like, we had written something, a year or so ago where it's like, we think really, one of the only platforms that really knows the number of users it has is Netflix, because you actually have to pay and log in. Almost every other set of numbers is, there's so much robots and garbage that you can't even tell. And so, like, could you, if you want to punish a company, could you, send a whole bunch of bot traffic to them so it looks like they have over the level of users that they have to work under different rules? I mean, you have all sorts of weird scenarios that you create with that.
And so one place where we've seen this kind of limit get put in place is in Germany with a law. There's a long German name that I can't pronounce, but NetzDG is the shorthand for it. And I think the cutoff in that law is they wanted to kind of capture social media companies. And one big challenge in thinking about like exactly what regulations are you drafting is which part of the internet stack, like which of the many different kinds of intermediaries are you actually trying to cover with this regulation? The legislators were very upfront about they wanted social media companies, but defining exactly what it means to allow users to post content publicly that other users can access and send messages to other users. Like, it's hard to describe something that captures just a Facebook and a Google and not also essentially every website with a comment section. So they tried, but then just also set a limit of if you had 2 million or more registered users in Germany, then all of the obligations of the law applied. And one of those obligations is a mandatory transparency report, where they are required to publish, certain information about how quickly they're responding to different orders. The law requires companies to respond quickly to assertions that from pretty much anybody, law enforcement, but also users, that one of 22 different provisions of the German criminal code has been violated by a piece of content on their site. So it's potentially a lot of different kinds of laws for the intermediaries to grapple with. But with this 2 million registered German users cutoff, we've seen transparency reports, I believe, only from 4 companies, from Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Change.org. As just the surprise entrant. I think they have a fairly robust German user base, and out of an abundance of caution, filing the report. And so one of the questions there is that right? Are there more sites that should be filing these reports? How are people calculating these questions? But also, one thing the German legislature did is try to cabin their regulation to, relevant to German sites, right? So talking about the number of German users, not the total user base. That's a question we would have to grapple with here in the US too. Are we talking about kind of the global platform, the global user base of these platforms? Are we talking just about the US numbers? What does that mean to who's in and who's out of the regulation? These are all questions that you have to, so to the big broad question that Carl asked about, what about the idea of cutting off, applying regulation just to certain, the minute you scratch the surface, you have to start answering a lot of complicated questions. And it's not, there's absolutely no case where it might make sense to have some kind. It's a really interesting question, to Mike's point, but we have to get a lot more in the weeds very quickly to really understand what the impact of any of these proposals would actually have.
And we'll go to questions in a minute, so start thinking. Jesse, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, just one quick point to underscore something that Emma just said that I think is an important facet of this debate. Is we spent a lot of time talking about companies whose the way in which most consumers interact with them is you go online and then you say something. But that is far from the only instance of where user-generated content exists online. So, quick poll: how many people have bought something from Amazon in the last year?
last
So,
hour.
like, I would bet you dollars to donuts that at least one of the things you bought wasn't sold to you by a product that Amazon owned and held in their warehouse and then shipped to you. It was sold by a third-party seller, right? Like, people who go on Amazon and upload their content, which is information about what things they would like to sell to the public, and then consumers are able to go on and find that content and say, I would like to buy this toothpaste, and then the toothpaste shows up at your house, right? The point of this is that, like, the things that we tend to think of in this category and tend to focus the most ardently in this debate on is like, this tweet was really offensive and should have been taken down, or this tweet, I can't believe they took it down, they were totally wrong about that, or Facebook post, or YouTube video, or what have you. But like the range of things that are enabled when you allow broad groups of people to come together, upload something to a platform, and then have other people come and view that platform is much broader and much deeper and much more nuanced. And that's why when you look sort of throughout the internet ecosystem, it's not just the folks who you might think of in the social media business or the speech business that are implicated by this, but like the actual speech, right? Like what I have available for sale, and I'm going to upload this to a website, right? Amazon does that, Walmart does that, right? Like these are major sort of cross-industry cutting applications of a thing that is uniquely American.
Yeah. I think that, just really quickly to add on that, like whenever you think about these kinds of laws and how you deal with them, you do have to think about, you know, not just the Facebook and Googles, and use the Amazon example, but like, you know, that extends, you know, like Etsy, right? I mean, Etsy is all of these, you know, individual sellers who are doing stuff. Or, you know, you think of like Wikipedia, right? And how does Wikipedia exist in a world without these kinds of protections? You know, and they've worked out, you know, one of the interesting things about Wikipedia is, right, the model that they use for content moderation is allowing the users themselves to moderate it. And they've, you know, even though everyone insisted that that would never work in any way when it first came around, and everyone sort of mocked it, and yet it's turned into something impressive. And so over and over again, allowing for this experimentation and recognizing that you have all these different platforms, and any particular attempt to eat away at those rules creates new problems. Or like the other one I always think of is like GitHub, right? You know, it's this repository for code and programs, and it is, you know, basically the most useful platform for code developers. You know, if you're making a change to these integrated reliability protections, like, do they have to think about, you know, what it is, which, you know, what code can be uploaded and do what? And so it has a really wide impact, way beyond what we normally think of.
Yeah, I get upset at that 1-star rating for District Taco as well, because that should come down. Any questions from the audience? Go ahead.
So I have a question mostly about Facebook and Amazon, because you guys have been talking about what they generally bring to the market in their, what they're trying to provide the consumer, but I also think that what they're doing to the provider is in some ways manipulative. So at least with Amazon, until January, they had a third-party pricing like contract where they were not allowed to have a cheaper price on the third-party provider on their own platform. So in that way, they're regulating from one side but not being held accountable on the other, and I see that as problematic. So I'm curious to what you think about that and like how you go forward in that kind of reform.
I mean, I was happy to see Amazon change that policy.
Yeah.
I thought that was a bad policy, but you know, I think that's a different issue than the issue of like intermediary liability and protections. That's sort of, you know, you can argue market power or sort of market dynamics of that in terms of, you know, what was happening the other day, sort of, you know, abusing a position of dominance to effectively fix pricing in some sense. And yet you see, you know, I mean, Amazon walked away from that for, you know, obviously facing potential threats from a variety of different corners, but you sort of recognize, like, you know, Amazon realized that they had to move away from that, and which I think was a good thing, and, you know, is helpful in the end. But that's I think a different issue than the intermediate liability protections in particular.
Yeah, I guess the only way that I see the overlap is in Section 230. It does, like you've mentioned, a lot of innovation, but it's also allowed these like mass platforms that are now, they have the majority of the market in that, and they're generally acquiring the innovation to add to their own platform. So it is really run just by like Facebook for social media, for instance, or Amazon for e-commerce. And I mean, there are a few others, but I think in that way, it does somewhat overlap, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, you can argue that there's overlap in terms of competition issues. I think competition is an important discussion, but I think it might be a different discussion. I'm not sure necessarily that like you could say that like a CDA 230 kind of situation enabled the competition issues that you're facing. It might be. I mean, that would be an interesting area to research and see if there's some element there. But you know, I worry about mixing up different issues and trying to solve one issue and saying like, well, these companies, you know, you can make an argument that companies are too dominant, there's not enough competition. You know, is 230 the lever to change that? And I think actually, you know, what the report shows is the opposite, that it's enabled all the investment into potential competitors. And so I worry that you might turn that knob the wrong way.
And legally, the question will be, is Section 230 an impediment to whatever other solution that you're looking at, right? Like if you think companies are buying up too many smaller companies and you want to have you know, something about competition policy, mergers and acquisition, how those mergers are reviewed, is there anything about what 230 says companies are not liable for how they treat user-generated content that stands in the way of that? If there is, then we have to talk about 230. But if it's not about that question of liability for user-generated content, then it's a really interesting and probably tricky question with a lot of political implications. But you don't actually have to amend 230 to potentially address that question.
Jesse, did
so I'd say sort of three things. One is what you're talking about in terms of most favored nation clauses exist online and offline, and that so in many ways it's a separate conversation. It's, as Emma said, a sort of interesting and fruitful one, but it is different than 230. The second thing that I'd say is in terms of antitrust enforcement, what we believe in and what has been sort of the last 40 or so years of American antitrust enforcement is focused on what's best for consumers, how's consumer welfare fair. And we have an enforcement agency, in fact 2 of them, that are charged with dealing with that. The third piece that I'd say though is I would be somewhat skeptical or at least hesitant to immediately embrace claims of dominance, that the dominance is going to endure simply because someone is large now, right? So Amazon, as an example, has something like half of online e-commerce, but only about 6% of U.S. retail. And there's a great post from a couple weeks ago by Alex Stapp up at a blog called Truth on the Market that goes through a series of firms across a range of industries that at their time were thought to be dominant. And there's whole areas of study about why seemingly dominant firms fail and fail somewhat regularly. There was a great cover of Fortune magazine that asked if anyone could defeat the cell phone king, and they were talking about Nokia. There was a piece that Forbes ran in the early 2000s called "How Yahoo Won the Search Wars." Right. So there's reason to be concerned. It's why we have antitrust enforcers to check against anti-competitive behavior. But I think it's a testable question of whether is the way that a business is operating and a market is functioning good for consumers, and what are the sort of chances that that firm might be displaced?
And you made one comment that I have a question about. You said that consumer welfare has been like the top priority for antitrust for the past 40 years. What do you think was the priority before that? So
I'll give you a colorful metaphor.
Okay.
So in a book called The Antitrust Paradox, Robert Bork described the way that antitrust enforcers worked prior to the last sort of 4 decades or so as kind of like a drunk sheriff from the Old West. He'd amble into town and pick out someone who maybe had done something wrong and maybe was just someone who didn't look at him the right way, and take out his pistol and pistol whip that person. Not necessarily because that was the biggest criminal in town for the sheriff to go after, but because it sort of showed that the sheriff was powerful, and it reminded people who was in charge. Antitrust previously was relatively unpredictable and was largely based on political will. Politician is angry at this company, therefore they need to be broken
And that goes back to your thought experiment as well, to be mindful of. Front row?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think the point about the dominance, I guess I do feel like, it strikes me as at least some of these companies are in a slightly different posture, only because not their dominance so much as their numerosity is exactly one of the things that they're leveraging as an argument for why they can't take on some of the content moderation. So the fact that your 1 billion Facebook picture upload today is an argument that Facebook has advanced, that the sheer number of their users is something that they're using as a continued argument for why we shouldn't do more, or why they shouldn't do more on their own.
So I actually read the situation the opposite way, right? Like, if you were to pick who in the world you think is like most capable, has the most resources to do content moderation perfectly, you'd probably pick the handful of companies, maybe not including Twitter, that are regularly blamed for screwing this up, right? So if the companies that, with the most money to hire the best lawyers, to invest in the best AI engineers, regularly make calls wrong, regularly reverse themselves, have, in some areas, 50% or below